About 3 weeks ago, David Ignatius, senior columnist for the Washington Post, wrote an article entitled The Pentagon is Learning How to Change at the Speed of War. And it began, for several decades, military reformers such as retired Navy Captain Jerry Hendricks have pleaded with the Pentagon to stop buying wildly expensive but vulnerable aircraft carriers and fighter jets, instead focus on getting vast numbers of cheap drones. Nobody seemed to listen. Actually, I've been listening for a long time to Captain Hendricks. His book is right here, To Provide and Maintain a Navy. I read his great piece in The Atlantic earlier this year, and he joins me now because a young Marine Corps officer said, why don't you get Captain Hendricks on to talk about a Mahan strategy? Good morning, Jerry. Welcome back.
Good morning, Hugh, and it's great to be here with you again.
I've told people about Ignatius. I remind them about your book. I remind them about your Atlantic article. Would you tell them about the exchange I got without naming our young Marine Corps friend and what he wanted to know?
Yeah, so I think what he's getting at is that one of the arguments I've been making here is that for a long period of time, we've had the ability in this country to do an all of the above strategy. And so we've attempted to be both a Mahanist or a sea power and also be a continentalist or a land power strategy. And the problem that we're facing right now is that one, although our GDP is still very strong, China's GDP has been growing. Russia has been able to carve out a really great sphere for itself in terms of technology, although it's kind of overextended on its defense budget right now. And so we've seen a rising competition where we're in a multipolar world right now. And so one of the arguments I made in To Provide and Maintain a few years ago was that we're reaching the point where we have to make a decision about what type of national security strategy we're going to follow. And I heavily suggest that we follow a Mahanist or a sea power national security strategy. And I think what the Marine is getting at is the fact that that is more than just building a Navy. It's in fact making a reinvestment in our commercial shipbuilding and building commercial fleets to gain that economic advantage that we see that China and South Korea and Japan are doing.
Now, would you explain who Alfred Mahan is and what a Mahanist strategy is overall for the Steelers fans out there?
Yeah, so I think it's more than just the Steelers fans. No, Captain Alfred Mahan was a naval strategist. He was an active duty Navy captain in the 1880s. He became the first president of the Naval War College, and he wrote a very influential book called, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And Mahan essentially tried to make an argument to his fellow countrymen that we needed to make a huge investment in an export economy. And mind you, this is the 1880s, 1890s. And very fortunately for him, there was a young man named Theodore Roosevelt who wrote the review for the Atlantic about the influence of sea power upon history. And Theodore Roosevelt and another guy named Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a senior senator, got behind this idea of investing not only in a larger Navy, but in a commercial fleet, because Mahan made the argument that the amount of, first of all, power comes from wealth and wealth comes from trade, and you gain a greater advantage by trading across the oceans. If you trade between countries on land, essentially you can get a 1-to-2 to the most about a 1-to-3 ratio. But the farther you go with shipping, because shipping is the cheapest form of trade travel, the cost per mile to ship a ton is cheaper by a ship than by anything else, cheaper than trains, cheaper than semis. And so what we found was when the Portuguese, for instance, rounded the Cape of Good Hope and started the spice trade with India, they were getting 10 to 20 to 1 ratios on their investment up front with the profit they were able to return. And what we began to see amongst the Western powers is an exponential growth in their gross domestic product and the improvement of the quality of their lives. And so the moment that we got this moment of international trade, where the great sea powers of the world began to step forward, Vienna, Great Britain, the Dutch, is that it's a takeoff of Western civilization, and it's all tied to the sea. Mahan recognized that we, the United States, sitting here in North America, astride two great oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, were the perfect and ideal location to be the nexus of trade. And he advocated for that, and Roosevelt invested in that. Roosevelt invested in the Panamanian Canal so that we could actually do a shortcut between the continents. And boom, if you look at the 20th century was the American century because of Roosevelt's significant investment in the Mahanist strategy. And I'm arguing that now is the time to return to that.
Now, Captain Hendricks, last week I had on a future senator and a current senator. The future senator, Dave McCormick, went to West Point, Army guy. He said we need a SHIPS Act like the CHIPS Act. And I said to myself, wait a minute, Jerry Hendricks already suggested that that's on the Hill. And then Roger Wicker, who's going to be the chairman of the Armed Services Committee next session, because I think the Republicans are going to take the Senate, he came on and said, we need to buy a lot of everything, including Navy ships. So maybe they're finally starting to turn their attention to provide and maintain. I don't know if Dave McCormick got your brief on the SHIPS Act. I hope he did. Tell people about what an ideal SHIPS Act would look like.
Well, thank you for that question, and I heard that interview, and of course I just got a huge grin on my face because yeah, we introduced the idea of the SHIPS Act in the Atlantic essay last year. The idea that much like what you've done with the CHIPS Act, where we recognized that there was a huge national security threat by being so dependent on overseas manufacturers of microchips, that in fact, when you realize that almost everything that the United States needs or that it wants to export is being carried on foreign built ships or bottoms, as we call them. And so the idea that all of your trade is dependent upon ships that are built by the Chinese is just antithetical to the national security interests of the United States, especially as we're turning or returning to being an export economy. We're already a net exporter of liquefied natural gas. There are other aspects of our reindustrializing economy here in the United States. And so, yes, I've been up on Capitol Hill. I'm not a lobbyist, but there's a lot of people that come talk to me about the idea about what would be contained within a SHIPS Act. And I've made the suggestion that there are about four pillars in this. One is an investment in workforce. The real challenge that we're having in building Navy ships right now is a lack of workers, or trained workers, certified workers, welders, pipe fitters, electricians. And so you need to make that investment. You need to make that investment not only for Navy shipbuilding, but in the commercial shipbuilding, because those workforces can flow back and forth. The other thing you need to look at is preferences. You need to make sure that in law that there's actually a requirement that some American products, some portion of our foreign trade actually should flow on American bottoms. We used to understand this. And before everyone gets up in arms and says, hey, the conservative theory is let the free market provide. Well, there's a difference between free trade and fair trade. If I told you that all of our allies and partners have preferences and that they are driving requirements of what they want to go on their bottoms and they're providing subsidies to their shipbuilding in order to support that to acquire market share, I'm simply suggesting that the United States at least match what our allies and partners are doing in order that we would be in a fair trade type of a situation, build the same plateau of support. So I want to see American hulls to be built so that we can create workforce. I also want to create a military sea lift command and merchant marines, mariners to drive these ships. So I grow that aspect of this. And that's what I think is important about a SHIPS Act is the idea of reshoring this basic national security industrial capability to build ships and repair them here in the United States, which we've allowed to dwindle over the last 40 years.
Captain Hendricks, I've been up to the California Maritime Institute. Maine has a maritime institute as well, and I think it's up in Castine. And if you go up to Castine, I visited it last summer, you go past the Bath Iron Works or the Bath Shipbuilding and the Portsmouth submarines. And maybe it looks to people like we're serious about this, but we really are not, are we?
We're not. If you look at, for instance, and I know that you've read Arthur Herman's great book Freedom's Forge, and you look at the number of dry docks that we had at the height of shipbuilding in World War II, where we're actually building a ship a day here in the United States as we were ramping up to meet the requirements of a Pacific and Atlantic war. Today we're down, to less than 20 dry docks of 500 feet or greater. And so we need to kind of reinvest in that critical infrastructure. We have one fewer Navy yards than what we actually need right now because we're so far behind on our submarine maintenance because we don't have enough dry docks. And we also are not investing in the commercial side. You may have noted that last week there was some big news that the South Korean firm Hanwha bought the old Philadelphia Navy Yard dry dock facility there from a Norwegian firm, Aker, who had been operating there. And they bought this yard, which is a huge industrial capacity, for only $100 million, which is about a quarter of what I thought it was worth. That's simply because the market here in the United States for commercial ships has been so sparse that Acre wanted to get out. And of course, the South Koreans are sort of anxious to get in right now to take their turn to see what they can do here so far as building new industrial practices. So we
Now,
really don't have the.
I read last week the Israeli Navy took delivery of its second of four lift capacity ships. They are landing craft. They came from Pascagoula. So we're obviously building ships and we're building submarines that we promised the Australians. I'll talk about that during the break with you about Ambassador Rudd. How soon can we ramp up if we know what we want and we stick to it, Captain Hendricks?
Yeah, I think, and I've stated this elsewhere, but I think it's going to take us 5 to 7 years to really ramp up if we know what we want. That's a big question, is actually having a plan, drawing a line for the number of ships that we want, the type of ships that we want, back to a specific yard, and then tasking that yard to start making the investments in its workforce and modernization. It will take between 5 to 7 years to be able to get back up on step. There are some things that we can do in the immediate near term, like extending the lives of some of the ships we already have, or recalling some ships that have gone to the retirement fleet, the ghost fleet right now, get them back up a step to sort of boost up our numbers. But to really turn things around, to add a Navy yard, to add additional commercial yards, you're talking about a 5 year investment plan right now, minimum. And I know that's bad news. I know people want to go faster. But the fact is that's the reality of industrial policy.
Now, when you say get another Navy yard, you mean like going back out to Alameda, which has not been redeveloped, even though it was supposed to be? I represent the guys that owned it for a while, and they can't do anything. There are 7 endangered species there. Do you mean authorized, notwithstanding any other law, to revive something like Alameda?
Yes, something like that. However, I would say that both Alameda and Hunters Point are problematic for us, not necessarily because of the capacities there. It's tremendous capacity there. It's workforce as well as the regulatory environment of the local California government. And I know what you said there about authorizing no other laws withstanding. It's still a hard place to do work is in California.
Captain, you are a great admirer of John Layman because of what he did for Ronald Reagan. I used to see him in the White House mess when I was a kid. Nobody wanted my opinion, but he was a great man, as was Caspar Weinberger. Have we got someone like that running around talking to Donald Trump right now to get them focused on a shipbuilding, a realistic plan like Layman had?
Yeah, so I don't know that there is because John Layman is so exceptional. And let me tell you why. John Layman knew the job that he wanted in the Reagan administration when it came in, and he knew that 6, 7 years before. When he was working for Henry Kissinger at the National Security Council, Layman was reserve bombardier navigator in the Navy. He loved the Navy, he loved ships, and he began to formulate a plan about what the Navy should look like in the future. And so when he left the Ford administration, when Carter came in, Layman spent 4 years essentially consulting, but also 4 years working on a plan to re-expand the Navy, to essentially create the 600 ship issue as a campaign issue. And so he developed that plan, and he developed it in great specific detail. The detail was down to the idea, here's the yard, here's the ship, here are the ships I want to pull out of mothballs. And so when he rolled into the 1980 presidential convention, the Republican convention, he made that plan the defense plank of the Republican Party that year. And so then when Reagan gets elected, Layman has offered other jobs, including Deputy Secretary of State. And Layman turns them all down. He keeps coming back to the White House and telling them, I want to be Secretary of the Navy. So they finally made him Secretary of the Navy. And then he came in and began to execute the plan, again, in specific detail. He had the first 100 days. He had the first 300 days. He had essentially 4 to 5 years of planning, and he did it. And so, he net added over 140 ships to the Navy across the 8 years of the Reagan administration. There were some decommissionings that occurred during that time. So the net plus up was about 87 ships across the Reagan administration. But the fact is we went from the low 500s to nearly 600, 594 ships actually at the peak. And essentially, John Layman's plan helped to win the Cold War. I don't know that there's anyone around today. Obviously, I've been working on my 456 ship Navy plan. And I've sort of drawn those lines between the number of ships I want and what yards I want to execute in, because my Navy looks somewhat different than the Navy that we have today. It's an evolved Navy that incorporates unmanned vessels to a greater extent. But the fact is I can't tell you that there's someone on Capitol Hill. I know that Mike Waltz has been looking at this very strongly. Former Congressman Mike Gallagher looked at these ideas. And so I know there's people
Jim
that are getting their
Banks,
mind.
Senator Banks to
Yes.
be, right? He's going to be one
Yeah.
of our
So Jim,
navalists.
Yeah, so Jim, actually, Senator Banks of my native and great sovereign state of Indiana, is going to be our next United States senator from the state, almost assuredly. Banks actually wrote a bill when he was in the House. He's still in the House now, but running for Senate, about a Five Oceans Navy Act, which is essentially was a rift on the Two Oceans Navy Act that occurred in 1938. So Banks has put his mind around this, and he understands that, like, for instance, we need ships that can operate in the Arctic, a place where Russia absolutely dominates right now. And so Banks is getting his mind around that well. And yes, I look forward to him to be on the Senate Armed Services Committee and perhaps the Sea Power Subcommittee once he arrives in the Senate next year.
Captain Jerry Hendricks is my guest, retired United States Navy, author of this wonderful primer on the Navy, To Provide and Maintain, of a great article in the Atlantic at the beginning of the year. Captain Hendricks, the Wall Street Journal serendipitously has a story this morning how Ukraine's naval drones turned the tide in the Battle of the Black Sea. Now, I've had Joe Lonsdale on this show. He makes submersibles. Palantir, Vanavar, Lucky Palmer's Anduril. I keep mentioning these four. There are actually 40 firms that want to produce the new weaponry we need. Will the Mahan strategy embrace what Ukraine has done and what Admiral Paparo has talked about and Admiral Studeman has talked about, which is hellscape? Use the drones and submersibles to deter our adversaries, most especially the People's Liberation Army Navy, from crossing the Taiwan Strait.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, drones, unmanned air, unmanned surface, and unmanned underwater absolutely has to be part of any battle plan, battle force that we create going forward, specifically when you start thinking about the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait. If you look at why drones have dominated the Black Sea, then you understand that drones will have a similar effect or could have a similar effect in these confined waters of the South China Sea as well as the Taiwan Strait. Now, there's a big difference in sea state. We're talking the Black Sea is a relatively calm sea, sea state 4 and less, whereas we can get to sea states 5, very, very high waves, a lot of turbulence that occurs in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. And so you're going to have to design your drones to be able to operate in that. You also have to deal with the difference in the ranges. The Black Sea Basin is circular, and you can almost always have communications with anything out to the middle of the Black Sea to shore. There are areas of the South China Sea as well as Taiwan Strait where communications is relatively poor. And so when you design your drone, you're going to have to integrate more autonomy, which is some of the things that Anduril is doing, and some of the other unmanned makers is investing heavily in the AI that would go with these drones. But the thing that really struck me, I just returned from Germany where I attended the Kiel International Sea Power Symposium last week, and drones were a big part of the conversation. We were focused on the Black Sea and what the Ukrainians have done by investing in these Sea Baby drones as well as the My drones. You're talking about something that's costing less than $250,000 to build, very low observable, uses jet propulsion, jet ski type propulsion, can have a range out to 1,000 kilometers, but it's bringing a package of 250 kilograms of explosive, and they are sinking large Russian capital vessels. They have driven the Russians back into port or out of the Black Sea. Russia's actually removed a lot of large capital vessels from the Black Sea, just want to get away from there because the Ukrainians are just embarrassing the surface force there. So I think that we absolutely have to invest. And I talked with David Ignatius about this, about my idea about creating a test range, a research development, prototyping test range, where we really go to town thinking about concepts of operations, working unmanned in with our manned Navy to work with the traditional Navy, the Arleigh Burkes and the new frigates we're building and our aircraft carriers and submarines, but integrating the unmanned into that has to be the new chapter of naval warfare. And we ought to be writing it, but we've been somewhat hesitant to get into it thus far.
Now, the new test range would be in Lake Erie, I hope, right? That's where we want to build that.
No, no, Hugh. And in all seriousness, and I understand what you're doing there, you Buckeye, you. The issue there, I've looked at the five Great Lakes as the place for the test range. Four of the Great Lakes actually share water space and border with Canada. Unfortunately, Canada is heavily compromised by the Chinese. The People's Republic is all over China, and on some exercises that we've done in the past, for instance, on Lake Huron, we've actually seen the Chinese show up on the other side of the lake with monitoring devices. So Lake Michigan is the only lake out of the five Great Lakes that's all U.S. territorial waters. We surround all of Lake Michigan. All the states that go around it are all U.S. territory. Lake Michigan also is like 990 feet deep during in the middle of the Chippewa Basin. There's already restricted airspace above it for aircraft to go out there and operate, and we're already bringing out our littoral combat ships and the new frigates to do our initial sea trials there on Lake Michigan. So it's the perfect place actually for us to do an internal, what I call Area 52, to do ConOps development, concept of operations development, away from prying eyes, get away from the Chinese, make sure the Chinese don't buy up land around Lake Michigan the way they've done around all of our missile bases in the West, and start going to town on unmanned development.
So, Captain Hendricks, in the last segment, we got about 7 minutes off air to do after this. We're going to talk about the price tag. People want to know if this is realistic. Can we do this? We have a minute to the break.
So absolutely, and we can get into the price tag. Senator Wicker has correctly adjudged that we need to get to 5% of gross domestic product. That's actually what we did during the Cold War when we were serious about competing against the Soviet Union. We're now competing against both Russia and China, two great powers. Iran is there in the wings. South Korea is causing us, or I'm sorry, North Korea is causing us problems. We need to make the investments that go with this. And if you can do that, then you can energize that industrial base. You can spread the industrial base away from just Maine and Pascagoula and get out and start hitting some of these smaller shipyards to build these unmanned vessels across the country.
Captain Hendricks is coming back for another 5 to 7 minutes to talk about budgeting concepts. So that'll be on Highly Concentrated Hugh podcast today. I'll try and get it on tomorrow morning as well. I want to thank Captain Hendricks and all of you who are listening to Provide and Maintain a Navy is his book. I want to thank Adam and Harley and Dwayne for producing today's program, and I will be back tomorrow. Thank you, everyone, for watching. I'm Hugh. I am back now for a final 7 minutes with Captain Hendricks talking about a Mahan strategy. You're worried that our land continentalist people in Big Army, Jerry Hendricks, shouldn't really be running the Pentagon, but I think you're either going to have Mike Pompeo or Tom Cotton running the Pentagon. I trust them, but what do you want them to come in thinking about in terms of a up budget, one-time expenditure, like the CHIPS Act for the SHIPS Act? What should they be thinking about in terms of money?
Okay, so first of all, I would say that I think the SHIPS Act should come not necessarily out of the Armed Services Committees. I think that actually should come out of Commerce and Transportation Committees in both the House and the Senate, because we're going to make a significant investment in the commercial industrial base. And that's important. You need to understand that South Korea right now is building if the equivalent of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, but they're building it for $1 billion a copy, whereas it's costing us $2 billion a copy. The reason why is that the South Korea firms essentially make their profit off from their large commercial industrial base. And so they are able to essentially build their surface combatants at market rate. We need to sort of bring that dynamic back to the United States. Right now, our shipbuilding industrial base just builds ships for the Navy. We've gone from where we were a major builder in the world during the 1970s, after we cut subsidies in the 1980s, and suddenly the only thing that we're building right now is Navy ships. And we've seen the average cost of an Arleigh Burke class destroyer, which we've been building, Hugh, for almost 32 years right now. DDG 51 hit the water in 1991 when I was a lieutenant junior grade. And the cost of that ship has doubled, even accounting for inflation, because of the rising cost of parts, as well as the rising cost of labor. We need to change that equation. So that SHIPS Act goes through Commerce and Transportation. Now, what Wicker is doing, Senator Wicker, I'm hoping the next chairman of Senate Armed Services Committee is doing the investment in the Navy. So making a huge surge of money. If you remember, when Reagan came in and Layman was Secretary of the Navy, we saw a net increase in the defense budget in the first year of almost 32%. The industrial base can take that and begin booking those ships downrange so that we can do the long lead procurement of steel and copper and everything that goes with that. And we can do what we call block buys. That is the cheapest and most efficient method of building ships, is buying them in large numbers. If you remember, Reagan twice built two carriers or bought two carriers in a single year. He did it two times during his time. Those were the cheapest carriers that we've ever built because we block buyed our carrier buys. I think that you have to take that approach to our submarines, to our destroyers, to the frigates, as well as anything unmanned. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm hoping that Senator Wicker will listen to this, is that we spread out that industrial base. We've talked before about the Last Supper, about how we actually planned to shrink the defense industrial base. We need a plan now, which I call First Breakfast, to essentially re-expand the defense industrial base. And we need to do that in a targeted way by identifying where the workforce is. Find those blue collar workers, know where the surplus is, know where they're waiting to go to work, and then make investments in smaller shipyards there to build your small, medium, and even your large unmanned vessels in new yards. And Hugh, I've identified some yards on the Great Lakes, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, in Wisconsin, and then also along the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. There's a couple of shipyards on the Ohio that can build small and medium unmanned. There's a couple of yards in Vicksburg, as well as in St. Louis, that could build some of the larger ships. And then, of course, we're building frigates right now on the Great Lakes. There's other places we could build larger vessels up there as well and get them out the St. Lawrence Seaway. But that's where workforce is. Also, we could go look back at California, Oregon specifically. There's a former Todd yard in Portland, Oregon, that I'd like to make a large investment in. But we need to have a plan where we actually draw that line to say, this is a ship I want to build, and here's the yard that's available and has the capacity to build that, and then execute that plan.
Last question, Jerry. Captain Hendricks is a friend. I call him Jerry occasionally at the Sagamore Institute. How much of that money goes abroad to Australia, Japan, Korea, and our Indo-Pacific allies, including Guam? And that's part of the United States, but I mean the Guam shipyard, the Guam Naval Facility. How much of that money goes abroad to our allies to increase their capacity?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there's much that we need to spend in Japan or in South Korea to increase their capacity. They have some of the largest and most modern shipbuilding facilities in the world. The main question we're going to have to ask is, are we going to finally come back to the day where we ask our allies and partners to really help us, to perhaps come here and make an investment here in the United States in one of our shipyards, modernize it, increase its infrastructure. But in return for that, especially in the near term, while they're making those investments, do we want to allow them to build some ships for us in their home yards, with the proviso that at the end of this, everything they build for us would be here in the United States, but get some quick returns on investment up front? I really like the idea of making significant investments in some of the smaller archipelagic island nations, so that I have ship repair capacity and perhaps ordnance rearming capacity out in the Pacific. We did that World War II, that when a submarine would run out of torpedoes, it didn't have to go all the way back to Pearl. It could actually go to one of these forward operating bases and get reloaded there. We're going to have to start thinking geostrategically again. This is something that Ambassador O'Brien brought up in his foreign affairs essay. We need to make some of these significant investments forward in order to do that. Now, how much? I think probably between 10 to 15%, but no more. 85% of it minimum has to stay invested here in the United States.
Captain Jerry Hendricks, retired United States Navy, author of To Provide and Maintain a Navy. Thank you, Captain. Always a pleasure to talk to you. We'll be back as the presidential season gets closer and the plans start to roll out. Thank you very much. Have a great 4th of July.
Thank you, Hugh. Same to you.